Um, I also want to remind you that there is a talk on Friday that I've sent you an email about, and I'm going to remind you, I think only Nicole was there. Where's Nicole? Was there yesterday at the talk, but there's a talk on Friday between 4:30 and 6 in 125 Morrison Hall, which is the music building, by a British journalist who does political commentary and rock journalism. And the title of the talk is Life on Respectable Street, the English Suburbs in Rock and Pop, from the Beatles to the Arctic Monkeys. So if any of you like any music between the Beatles and the Arctic Monkeys, I think you'll enjoy this talk. I went to a talk that he did last night. He's a very entertaining presenter. Okay, so I'm going to do something slightly different today to give you a bit of a break from me. Hard to imagine that you'd want it, but I'm going to just do a very short lecture which will set up a video that I'm going to show you, which will run for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion after that, after we watch that video. So be sure not to, I will dim the lights, I won't be handing out popcorn, and I do not want you falling asleep, because I want you to be fully engaged in the discussion that we'll have afterwards. Okay, so the last two lectures have been looking at these competing visions of Britain after the First World War. The one, this attempt to rebuild and stabilize and heal the wounds of Britain by heading to the suburbs and to the countryside. And the other concerned increasingly with the idea that you could plan a better future. That was, I was suggesting, the beginnings of a radically different type of political and economic organization. We've already seen hints in these two lectures of the scale of the economic depression that fell on Britain in the 20s and the 30s. And we had this rather bizarre contrast of, on the one hand, seemingly a growing affluence in the south of England and a increasing amount of poverty and unemployment further north. And so today what I'm going to talk about is essentially that contrast. And particularly I'm going to be talking to you yet again about how poverty gets rediscovered in the 1930s, because it's a hugely important for what happens in Britain after the Second World War. Now, the idea of North and South, the idea that Britain as a nation was divided into two nations, North and South, is a very old idea. Okay, Disraeli, the old conservative prime minister, in 1845 had written a novel called Sybil, The Tale of Two Nations. Actually, it's just called The Two Nations. And Elizabeth Gaskell also wrote a very famous novel called North and South in 1854. Okay, so even in the middle of the 19th century, you have a sense of imagining Britain as made up of two quite different geographical blocks. Now, they get configured slightly different. In Disraeli and in Gaskell, they're referring to the north as the home of the industrial working class, and of the south as the site of privilege and of power. Okay? But even though they're making that contrast, it's clear that the future, the modern world, if you like, is placed in the north. Okay? The north is seen to be at the cutting edge. It may have been ugly, it may have been nasty, but it was the generator of wealth and prosperity. It was the path to the future. Between the wars in Britain, that gets fundamentally revised. Okay, so the North still stands in as representing the industrial working class, and the South of affluence and privilege. But the North is now seen to be something of an old industrial relic, belonging to the era of industrialization. Okay? It was something that had been passed by in many ways by a new type of modernity that had been emerging in the south of England, where there was many more cinemas, many more factory girls looking like actresses, and so forth. The last thing I want to say then is that this image, as you'll see today, is gendered in a very particular type of way. Okay? The North is associated with masculinity. The industrial working class is overwhelmingly portrayed as being composed of men, even though we know women continue to make a significant part of the workforce and suffered from unemployment equally heavily in the textile industries. The South, in contrast, is increasingly portrayed as and associated with a new feminine type of world. Sometimes the suburbs, sometimes a new set of domestic pleasures, sometimes a new type of workers in the new industries that I was talking about last on Tuesday. And so what you have, and why I've chosen this, what I think is a fabulous portrayal of this distinction. Okay, this is the artist Thomas Dugdale, and here you have the image of a high society couple, complete with cigarette holders, long ball gowns, looking out of their apartment in the Ritz down at the arrival of the hunger marchers who had just arrived in London from Jarrow, which was an industrial town in the northeast that you're going to hear more about today. Here you have, I think, dramatically portrayed this enormous gap between the rich and the poor, the North and the South. So let me, by the way, I'm not going to be going back over these headings. Okay, so get these headings down, because these will be, I'm going to basically talk in these three sections about prosperity, then poverty, and then the documentary movement before we get to the movement. The new prosperity. Okay, this is to remind you that the South is this newly affluent, thriving place in Britain. And you can do this in a number of ways. Okay, on Tuesday I gave you the aggregate figures of wages and prices, and we saw in the aggregate figures that wages basically slipped a bit in the late 20s and early 30s, and then rose by the late 30s to a point higher than in the early 20s, and that the cost of living was falling all the time. Okay? Those aggregate figures don't tell you this story, which is the rise of the suburban salaried middle class. Okay? This is a new social group in many ways. We've had an industrial bourgeoisie for much of the 19th century, the people who owned mills, who ran factories, etc., etc. What we are talking about now is a new social formation of someone like me, okay, who earns a monthly salary, doesn't get a weekly wage check, okay, has a pension, has a type of security that many people in the 19th century didn't possess. Okay, so these people grow significantly in size between the wars. Okay, and move up to from 21 to 27% of the population. Okay, so there are members of what used to be the respectable working classes becoming a part of this social group, and their income is increasing. Okay, not only is their income decreasing and the cost of living declining, but their wages are going further, their salaries are going further because the size of middle-class households are getting smaller. This is the era, basically, of the 2.5 children, okay, particularly in middle-class in middle-class homes. So I've given you two sets of figures of characteristic types of middle-class figures. The bank clerk, probably at the lowest rung of the middle-class ladder, whose salary doubles between 1914 and 1918, and doctors, at the upper end of the salaried middle class. And you can see why they're at the upper end of the salaried middle class, because their wages almost triple during this same period. Okay, so remember that this group is basically becoming more affluent, okay, and that they are increasingly concentrated in the south of England. Not all, clearly, they're doctors scattered all over the country, they're bank clerks spread all over the country. But the predominant middle-class experience is in London and the southeast. Yeah. How much were houses? That's a great question, and I really can't give you an answer to that. I can tell you that property ownership is still only around 15 or 20%. Okay? So you still have a remarkably small amount of people owning their houses, but as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that too is increasing in the 20s and 30s, and these are the people who are buying them. Okay, the other side of the story then is the story of the increasing grinding poverty of the 1930s. Okay, so let me start by reminding you something that I told you on Tuesday, which is that unemployment consistently stays between 10 and 25% of the workforce during the 1920s and 1930s. That means in actual figures that we're talking about unemployment, about 1.5 million up to 3 million people unemployed throughout that period. But and as I showed you last week, wages decline in many industrial sectors, leaving 30% of the population living on under £3 a week. Remember, Booth and Rowntree had discovered that 30% of the population were living behind the poverty line. So basically, we haven't really progressed from the late Victorian period. The key point, though, is that unemployment isn't just between 10 and 25% of the workforce everywhere. There are real areas of regional and local concentration of unemployment. And of course, those areas tend to be in the industrial areas of Britain. So the coal mining areas around the in South Wales, the industrial Midlands around Birmingham, the industrial Northwest around Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, the industrial Northeast around Newcastle, and the Clydeside in Scotland around Glasgow. Okay, those are the key areas of unemployment. And in particular towns, when a big factory went down, went bust or closed up, you could have unemployment reaching 80% of that locality. Okay, so but we're talking about basically, very few people in the town being in work. And the example of Jarrow, which you'll hear about shortly, is one of those cases. When the big shipyard of Palmer's is closed down, the unemployment in the town reaches 80%. And with that type of poverty comes a whole series of other things, like malnutrition, like higher infant mortality, whole series of other measures that we could go into, but I don't have time.